Our next speaker is Sarah Leah Whitson. Sarah Leah is the Executive Director of Dawn. Previously, she served as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division from 2004 until 2020, overseeing the work of the divisions of 19 countries and with a staff located in 10 countries. Sarah Leah has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, focusing on issues of armed conflict, accountability, legal reform, migrant workers, and human rights. She has published widely on human rights and foreign policy in the Middle East in international and regional media, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Times, and CNN. She appears regularly on Al Jazeera, BBC, NPR, MSNBC, and CNN. Previously, Sarah Leah worked in New York for Goldman Sachs & Co. and Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. She graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard Law School. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is on the boards of ICJP, Artistic Freedom Initiative, Freedom Forward, Al-Qasset for Human Rights, and Sinai Foundation for Human Rights. She speaks Armenian and Arabic. Sarah Leah will be addressing the international reaction to the report, including from Israel. Thank you.
If I can get this to fit here. Great to see so many familiar faces, so many friends here today. And the topic I'm going to talk about is shifting a little bit back to here in the UK and the US. As we've heard today, there's a growing consensus by human rights organizations and the broader public that Israel is committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution. This recognition takes place in the context of declining public support for Israel, particularly in the United States, as the public has access to unfiltered coverage of relentless Israeli abuses. While the facts, the law, and public opinion are converging on what should lead to global action to end Israeli apartheid and war crimes, there's an active campaign by the Israeli government and its supporters, most notably here in the United Kingdom and in the United States, to delegitimize, silence, and punish efforts to hold Israel accountable for its crimes in ways that threatens the freedoms we have in our own countries, particularly freedom of speech. Israel is now exporting its authoritarian tactics of repression to our own countries, seeking to punish those who speak critically about Israel and seek to hold it accountable. We've now entered a stage where our own governments, the British government, the American government, must choose between the interests of the Israeli government to preserve its impunity at all costs and the interests, our cherished rights and freedoms, of their own citizens. Since the growing determinations by leading international Palestinian and Israeli organizations that Israel is committing the crimes of apartheid, dozens of countries have formalized their positions about Israeli apartheid. The 54 countries of the African group, the 22 countries of the Arab group, and the 57 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, noting there's some overlap among them, as well as Venezuela. At the March UN Human Rights Council session, they all referenced Israel's apartheid, with the African group demanding that Israel dismantle and ban the Israeli system of colonialism and apartheid as required by international law. We've also seen repeated references made by the African Union and Luxembourg and France's foreign ministers, as well as former Secretary of State John Kerry, and nearly every former Israeli prime minister referencing an apartheid reality under Israeli rule. Even Israel's staunchest supporters in the US and the UK have been tepid in their defense of the apartheid designation. It's not our assessment, said the State Department. We're waiting for a court ruling. The growing apartheid conclusion has emerged in the context of a significant shift in both public and elite foreign policy opinion in their understanding of the situation on the ground. From national broadcasters to Washington think tanks, from the floor of the US Congress to street protests around the world last year and this year, in the wake of Israel's 2021 war in Gaza, in the wake of the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, the conversation has shifted far away from the regurgitated stale defenses of Israel's right to exist, terrorists, and anti-Semitism, to a new recognition of Palestinian rights to equality and freedom. Even staid American think tanks have shifted their analysis, abandoning the mythical infinite placeholders of a two-state solution and a peace process relied on by Israel, the UK, and the US to justify the status quo of support for endless military occupation. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where several senior Biden officials hail from, now recommends a new policy framework that centers equal rights and freedom for Palestinians and Israelis living under Israel's authority in a one-state reality. On the face of it, the growing call for equality, non-discrimination, and human rights should be uncontroversial, as they're basic global values. Who can oppose equal rights? But such a call is tantamount to an intellectual earthquake in the context of Israel, which is legally and politically predicated on Jewish ethno-national supremacy and Palestinian expulsion. A call for equal rights and all that entails: equal voting rights, equal political participation, equal national rights for Jews and Christians and Muslim Palestinians alike. The shift to a focus on equality for Palestinians has even seeped into US government statements, such as Secretary of State Blinken's now repeated pronouncement that Israelis and Palestinians should enjoy equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and democracy. The most important reason for this shift has been the ability of Palestinians to document, report, and explain their daily lives under subjugation and military occupation to a broader global audience. They have leapfrogged using social media over traditional media gatekeepers that would otherwise routinely depict them as a singular terrorist entity. The increased diversification of the foreign policy establishment within the British and American governments, think tanks, academia, and journalism to at last include not just people of color generally, but Muslims and Arabs in particular, has been another factor in this evolution. The Israeli government and its defenders here in the United Kingdom, but especially in the US, have fallen back on their regular playbook to deflect from the ugly reality with a strategy that amounts primarily to shooting the messenger by smearing them as anti-Semites in order to intimidate and silence them. That's why the Israeli government has spent and will continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars over the past decade to defeat speech critical of Israel here in the UK and the US and around the world. Labeling Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International as biased and anti-Semitic has been the tried and tested knee-jerk approach. Labeling Al-Haq as terrorist has been another old goodie. A joint statement by the American groups that claim to be pro-Israel, including AIPAC, accused Amnesty of seeking to demonize and delegitimize the Jewish and democratic state of Israel. But what's new and different is that this silencing strategy is now relying on vastly expanded legal tools to silence speech, tools that pretty clearly can and will be used to punish speech like ours, here, now, talking about Israeli apartheid and advocating for action. This includes the anti-boycott, divestment, and sanction laws in at least 30 American states, as well as emerging efforts in the UK that seek to punish those in our countries who advocate for accountability for Israel. In the UK, to date, the legislation is limited to a ban on public service pensions from divesting in companies if their decisions are not in line with government foreign policy. But it's hard to see how divestment to protest settlements, which the UK has condemned as illegal, would be contrary to UK policy. Note that Special Rapporteur Link has called on UK local pension funds to divest their $4.4 billion in investments in Israeli companies that contribute to abusive Palestinians. Unfortunately for the Israeli government, which has worked lockstep with pro-Israel groups to pass these laws, in many cases secretly funding them, the anti-BDS laws have faced freedom of speech challenges in appellate courts that have struck down enforcement of these laws. In Germany and France as well, efforts to pass anti-BDS laws have faced successful free speech challenges in court. That's why Israel's strategy will increasingly focus on expanding official adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, and then to push for its enforcement of the law on the same basis as hate crimes. The definition's examples of anti-Semitic speech would include a legal conclusion that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. Example 11 from the definition cites as anti-Semitic speech denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, by example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. So, if one argues that Israeli government policies since the state's inception to carry out the crime of apartheid are a racist endeavor, we can expect efforts to enforce the IHRA definition against the speaker as anti-Semitic. But the UK government formally adopted this working definition of anti-Semitism, but did not include the definition's annexes, which include these problematic examples. The Conservative and Labour parties, however, have adopted the examples, including example 11, in toto. We can expect that there will be expanded efforts to widen adoption and push for enforcement in local legislatures and civil society organizations. The definition has been adopted by some British universities and local councils and applied or threatened as a ban on public meetings. So, Israeli Apartheid Week at various universities, and a proposal to refuse the BDS a meeting place by Barnet Council Hall. It's also readily been used to launch formal investigations of professors at several universities deemed to be too critical of Israel's policies. It will be used to sanction and fire those deemed to breach the definition, and it will be used to cut off funding of institutions that are deemed to breach the definition. The Trump administration tried, as its term ended, to issue a resolution condemning Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Oxfam, among others, as anti-Semitic organizations, and urging other governments not to support them, but ran out of time to pursue the effort. Increasingly, we're seeing local governments also curtail pro-Palestine speech by banning protests, for example, in the wake of the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh in Berlin. Corporate social media and communication companies like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Zoom have jumped aboard, banning posts or even entire accounts that shared posts promoting Palestinian rights as anti-Semitic. The chilling effect is quite clear. Even if courts reject enforcement as an infringement on speech, the aim is to impose costs and notoriety via investigations and lawsuits. So yes, this is about the crime of apartheid by Israel, but it's also about our governments here in the UK and the United States and across Europe failing to protect our rights, our free speech, by supporting the Israeli government promoted anti-BDS and anti-Semitism rules in our own countries. And the Israel copycats are flourishing, seeking to mimic these tactics with over 100 new laws that sanction other kinds of political speech, like advocacy on climate change, fossil fuels, or gun control by their respective lobbying and corporate groups, labeled as, I kid you not, anti-firearms discrimination, or boycotts of oil and gas companies, or even writ large against requirements for environmental, social, and governance disclosure policies. They are passing laws to punish people who advocate for these measures. This is what exporting authoritarianism looks like. Not satisfied with its own anti-BDS laws in Israel, and now considering laws to sanction speech that describes Israel as an apartheid state, Israel is now pushing laws and rules to sanction free speech in Western democracies and contributing to the deterioration of our freedoms across a range of topics of tremendous importance to our citizenry. If it's not enough for us to care about what's happening to Palestinians under apartheid, I hope we will at least care about our own rights and freedoms here. Thank you.